Indigenous Rights Radio, because knowledge is power.
You are now listening to Cultural Survival's Global News Bulletin. Every month, Cultural Survival brings you the latest news impacting Indigenous peoples across the globe. This January edition features important stories from Europe, North, Central, South America, Africa, Asia, and beyond. Starting news from the United States. A new report by Federal Bureau reveals Native Americans are twice as likely to face medical debt collections, often for bills they don't owe. This disparity stems from problems within the Indian health service programs, which refers patients to outside providers but usually fails to pay the resulting bills. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau found that 8% of Native Americans living in majority Native areas had medical debt in collections, compared to the national average of 4%. This figure rises to 11.5% in areas without an Indian health service facility. The report highlights administrative delays, billing errors, and underfunding within the Indian health service as key contributors to this issue. These problems leave many Native Americans struggling with medical debt and facing barriers to accessing essential healthcare services. While proposals to erase medical debt from credit reports exist, their future remains uncertain under the new administration and Congress. In Australia, the Victorian government is offering $50 vouchers to Aboriginal people who attend mob-only treaty talks. This initiative aims to boost participation in the state's first People's Assembly, which is negotiating Australia's first treaty with Indigenous citizens. Despite low voter turnout in recent Assembly elections, the government is pressing ahead with the negotiations. Critics argue that the vouchers are a decisive tactic, highlighting a lack of a genuine interest in the treaty process. The Assembly defends the problems, emphasizing the importance of gathering diverse Indigenous perspectives. Non-Indigenous attendees are welcome at some events but must pay for the tickets, prompting accusations of reverse racism and further fueling debate. Similar treaty initiatives are underway in other Australian states, with Victoria leading the way in establishing legal frameworks for Indigenous treaties. In Canada, Indigenous leaders are calling for immediate action on the chronic underfunding of First Nation policing. Netmi Zagaming Nisnavek Chief Louis Kwisiwa, who declared a state of emergency in his community due to escalating violence, stressed the urgent need for resources to combat crime and address mental health and addiction crisis. A Canadian human rights tribunal hearing is scheduled for January 6 to 24, 2025 to address the Indigenous police chiefs of Ontario's complaint against the federal government. Leaders accuse Canada of delaying tactics and neglecting the safety of First Nations communities. While the Ontario government recently announced significant funding for the Nisnawe ASCII police services, Indigenous leaders maintain that the federal government must fulfill its obligations to ensure equitable policing and community safety for all First Nations. News from Africa. In Uganda, In Uganda's Queen Elizabeth National Park, the Basongora people, the area's original inhabitants, resist eviction from their enclave village within the park. They argue that conservation efforts should include their interest and acknowledge their historical connection to the land. While electric fences protect communities outside the park from elephants, the Basongora view them as symbols of exclusion. They advocate for a more inclusive approach to conservation that respects their rights and incorporates their traditional knowledge. The Basongora's struggle highlights the need for the conservation strategy shift that moves beyond exclusionary fines and fences models. It emphasizes the importance of recognizing indigenous land rights and involving indigenous communities in decision-making processes to foster a more just and sustainable approach to conservation. In St. Vincent, Balisos, a tiny island in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, is a site of a deep historical trauma for the Garifuna people. In the 1790s, thousands of Garifuna, descendants of Africans and indigenous Kalinagos, were exiled to the island by the British colonizers and perished due to harsh conditions and disease. Today, the Garifuna consider Balisos a sacred place and campaign for its recognition as a heritage site. They believe their ancestors' spirit remain connected to the island, and many report spiritual experiences during visits. The island is privately owned and for sale, but the Garifuna assert their ancestral claim and urge the government to acquire it. Prime Minister Ralpha Gonçalves has pledged to do so, potentially through the courts if necessary. Now, news from Asia. In the Philippines, Amnesty International reports that indigenous communities in the Philippines are suffering human rights violation due to the rising demand for nickel, a key component in electric vehicle batteries. Mining operations in Zambales and Palawan are causing deforestation, heavy metal contamination, and health problems despite inadequate community consultation and flawed consent processes. The report also found that indigenous people were denied access to crucial project information and excluded from decision-making. The bribery allegations have also surfaced. The report urges the Philippine government to suspend mining operations and investigate the abuses while calling the EV companies to ensure their supply chains are free from human rights violations. Quote, "It is time to stop sacrificing the human rights, health, and environment of indigenous peoples," unquote, said Amnesty researcher Alisa Kambe. In Bangladesh, the International Chittagong Hill Tracks Commission expresses outrage over the arson attack on the Tripura community in the Noton Tongziripara, Bandarban district on December 24, 2024. 17 houses were burned to ashes while residents celebrated Christmas in the neighboring village. Media reports allege that associates of former IGP Benazir Ahmed, known for the land grabbing in Chittagong Hill Tracks, were involved. This incident highlights a broader pattern of violence and displacement of indigenous communities in Bangladesh. The commission calls for an immediate investigation and prosecution of the perpetrators. It urges the interim government to honor the CST accord by cancelling illegal land leases and operationalizing the CST Land Dispute Resolution Commission. The government must provide urgent relief and rehabilitation to the affected families and enact policies to safeguard indigenous lands. Failure to act undermines the principle of justice and equality placed by the interim government. Similarly, in a separate incident, violence erupted in Dhaka when a group called Students for Sovereignty attacked indigenous protesters, demonstrating against the removal of the word Adivasi from textbooks. At least 20 people were injured, many seriously, as the attackers used cricket stump and sticks to assault the protesters, mainly targeting women. Witnesses reported the attackers chanting nationalist and religious slogans. Police detained 2 individuals, but no charges have been filed. The indigenous groups vowed to continue protesting, demanding justice for the attack and recognition of their rights. Now, news from Americas. In Chile, in a historic win for indigenous rights, the Mapuche Curarawe community in Chile secured a landmark agreement for the co-management of Villarrica National Park. Signed on December 3, 2024, this agreement marks the culmination of a 7-year struggle that began with the community asserting their territorial rights within the park. Through dialogue and collaborations with the National Forest Corporations and the Ministry of National Assets, the Curarawe established a governance and management council, ensuring their voices in the park's future. This precedent-setting agreement provides a model for indigenous-led conservation and recognizes the vital role of traditional knowledge in protecting natural and cultural heritage. In Argentina, the Argentine government has revoked the legal safeguards for indigenous land rights in a controversial move. A new decree, justified by President Javier Milei, ends an 18-year-old policy protecting indigenous communities from eviction. Milei claims the protections hindered economic activities and individual property rights. This decision allows for the displacement of indigenous peoples from ancestral lands, many of which have been illegally sold. This action has sparked outrage, with critics highlighting the potential for social and environmental devastation. Indigenous communities, often stalwarts of biodiversity and sustainable land management practices, face losing their homes and livelihoods. The decree threatens their cultural heritage and the health of vital ecosystems. This decision raises serious concerns about Argentina's commitment to indigenous rights and environmental protection. In Ecuador, indigenous communities in Ecuador's Pastaza province have declared a state of emergency and are mobilizing against the construction of a maximum security prison in the Amazon. Leaders from 7 indigenous nationalities, represented by the Indigenous Nationalities Confederation of Ecuador and the Ecuadorian Indigenous Nationalities of Amazon Confederation, convened a popular assembly and unanimously rejected the prison project in the Archidona, Napo province. This historic gathering saw indigenous, social and community leaders voice their strong opposition to the penitentiary, citing violations of their rights and expansion of harmful extractive projects in the Amazon. The assembly concluded with 3 key resolutions: a complete rejection of the prison, a declaration of regional state of emergency, and a call for active resistance against government policies that threaten indigenous territories and livelihoods. The communities demand respect for their self-determination and halt projects that endanger the fragile Amazon ecosystem. In Costa Rica, indigenous educators from Latin America convened in San Jose, Costa Rica for the 11th regional meeting on public education and indigenous peoples. Representing diverse communities and educational unions from countries like Argentina, Brazil, and Guatemala, they gathered to address the pressing challenges facing indigenous education. A key concern raised was the chronic underfunding hindering the implementation of indigenous education laws. The participants highlighted the precarious working conditions faced by indigenous teachers, including limited training opportunities, excessive workloads, and inadequate infrastructure. The devastating impact of climate change on indigenous communities, further exacerbating educational access, was also a primary focus of discussion. This regional meeting was a crucial platform for indigenous educators to advocate for improved resources, better working conditions, and culturally relevant education that empowers their communities. In Peru, the Shipibo Conibo community in Peru has condemned Vogue Mexico and Latin America senior editor Jose Forteza and Peruvian designer Anaisa Samanez for culturally appropriating their traditional designs. During the Oricanes 2024 event, Samanez expressed frustration with the community's refusal to share their textile knowledge for free. Forteza did insult to injury by claiming the communities would be starving if not for the Samanez use of their designs. These remarks sparked outrage, highlighting the exploitation of indigenous knowledge and the need to respect their intellectual property rights. The Shipibo Conibo people are known for their intricate geometric patterns called kene, which hold deep cultural and spiritual significance. This incident underscores the importance of ethical collaborations and fair compensation when working with indigenous communities. That is all for this edition of Cultural Survival's Global News Bulletin. Stay tuned for our next broadcast. For more information on the rights of indigenous peoples, visit cs.org and follow Cultural Survival on Facebook, Instagram and X.